thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, and thanks so much for being here. So I want to say first that this is a project that's in its really early stages. The finished paper that I'm going to make out of the talk I'm doing today is for a special issue of the journal Palimpsest, a journal on women, gender, and the Black International. And they're doing a special issue on the work and legacy of Octavia Butler. It's going to come out later this year. So that's what I'm going to be producing from this. But today I just wanted, this is really like I'm laying the groundwork for the article I want to write. So I'm going to be introducing you to Butler's short story, Bloodchild. I'm going to be setting up some of the complex ways of approaching this work, and I'm going to sketch out my own approach. So you see that there's like so much going on, and I have a lot to say, so I'm just getting started in the direction I want to go with the paper. So I really welcome questions and feedback of any kind at this stage because this is very much a work in progress. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to Octavia Estelle Butler, who is the American writer that so many fans, scholars, and critics recognize as one of the most influential and imaginative science fiction and speculative fiction writers. So she was very well recognized during her lifetime. She won multiple science fiction writing awards, also a MacArthur Genius Grant in 1995, which is a pretty big deal. And then this is the 10th anniversary of her death this year, so there's kind of a renewed scholarly attention, really stuff coming up in 2016. Butler's novels and short stories exploit the radical possibilities of the SF form. In her hands, common science fiction tropes like time travel, space exploration, alien encounters, telepathy, and vampires become tools to challenge deeply entrenched social norms like white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, monogamy, human exceptionalism, and capitalism. But a crucial feature of her work is that it never yields easy interpretations. It's always about difficulty in different forms. So the difficulty of constructing alternatives to dominant ways of being and thinking, the difficulty of managing diverse and conflicting interests, and the difficulty of recognizing the limitations to any single version of a better world. So the story I'm talking about today is called Bloodchild, and this is a very short story. It was first published in 1984 in the Isaac Asimov science fiction magazine. I found the cover of that here. Bloodchild is narrated by an adolescent human boy. His name is Gan. He lives with his family in a small colony of humans on a planet far from Earth. Several generations prior to the events of the story, Gan's ancestors fled persecution and enslavement on their homeworld in order to settle and thrive elsewhere in the universe. But on their new home planet, humans are not the dominant species. Their hosts are the Tlick. They're an insectoid people with many pairs of limbs, sharp claws, segmented bodies that are 3 meters long, and an exceedingly long lifespan. At the moment of the story, humans and Tlick coexist in a fragile peace founded upon a very unusual relationship. So the refugee humans are allowed to stay on the Tlick planet only because they are recognized as a useful assisted reproductive technology. The Tlick, they're insectoid, they need warm-blooded bodies to serve as hosts for their fertilized eggs, nourishing the developing grubs with blood until they are mature and ready to be born. And by being born, the grubs are cut out of the host body. Has anyone read this story?
Just yesterday.
Cool. Thanks, Tim. So in this system, this fragile piece that they worked out, humans, they're also called Terrans because they come from Earth, the humans live independently on a preserve. Each family is required to provide one human per generation to a Tlick individual in a kind of adoption process that joins the families of both partners into an extended interspecies unit. But we learned through briefly sketched backstory that there's a history of violence and a cluster of tensions that haunt this present accord. So many humans resent the physical and legal constraints placed on their lives and are aghast at the reproductive obligation to the Tlick. Many Tlick, on the other hand, are impatient with their lack of individual access to the pool of potential human hosts. Prior human attempts at resistance resulted in bloody casualties on both sides and led to a total ban on the human possession of weapons, according to the Tlick discourse, for their own protection. So Gan's family occupies a unique position in this complex social system. His mother, Lean, is the lifelong friend of a prominent Tlick named Tiga Toy. So Gan has grown up with the idea of Tiga Toy as a beloved family member, and because of the terms of the accord, also as his eventual reproductive partner. So as the government official in charge of the preserve, Tiga Toy is the liaison between two very different populations, working to maintain the interests of both through compromise and alliance. So here's a long quote that gives you a good sense of what's going on at the moment of the story. Tiga Toy was hounded on the outside. Her people wanted more of us made available. Only she and her political faction stood between us and the hordes who did not understand why there was a preserve, why any Terran could not be courted, paid, drafted, in some way made available to them. She parceled us out to the desperate and sold us to the rich and powerful for their political support. Thus, we were necessities, status symbols, and an independent people. She oversaw the joining of families, putting an end to the final remnants of the earlier system of breaking up Terran families to suit impatient Tlick. I had lived outside with her. I had seen the desperate eagerness in the way some people looked at me. It was a little frightening to know that only she stood between us and that desperation that could so easily swallow us. So this passage, I think, really shows us the knot of tensions that's underlying this story. So the humans are an independent people on one hand, but they're also status symbols, they're parceled out, and they're sold. The reproductive partners, the human Tlick partners, are family, but they're also conscripts. On this planet, the humans are bodily hosts for the Tlick young, but they're also guests of the Tlick, or from another perspective, they're prisoners of the Tlick. And Gan, the narrator, both loves Tiga Toy and cherishes the chance to be her partner, on the one hand, and fears her and her people for the power they hold over the human population, on the other hand. There's a lot of setup to this story, but the plot is actually very simple. So a quiet evening at Gan's family home is interrupted by the arrival of a human man, Bram, who is about to give birth. That is, the grubs in his body have eaten out of their egg case, and if they're not removed quickly, they're going to begin eating his flesh. So without the presence of his Tlick partner, who is deathly sick, Bram is in terrible pain and in grave danger. So there's also this, there's a biological bond of some sort between the human and the Tlick partners. The Tlick have a sting, and they also have sterile eggs, and these two forms of biological matter they give to the humans, and it's kind of a narcotic. It calms them, and it also prolongs their life and makes them really healthy. So Bram needs his partner to get through this birth, basically. In the story's gruesome central scene, Gan watches horrified as Tiga Toy cuts the grubs out of Bram's body, barely saving his life. After this trauma, Gan begins to question whether he can bear a future as a birthing body, and whether the relationship between himself and Tiga Toy is one of genuine love or opportunistic exploitation. He considers suicide, but after an emotional conversation with Tiga Toy, the two are reconciled, and Gan is implanted with Tiga Toy's first fertilized egg. So the story ends on a hopeful note after all this trauma. So this dense little story packs in a number of different problematics and invites a range of approaches. And I want to lay out some of these as briefly as I can before I move into my own reading that I'm hoping to develop in this paper. So the first vector of approach, one that comes up in almost every critical reading of this story, is the question of slavery. And the reason slavery always comes up is at least partly because Octavia Butler, the author, she herself repeatedly disavows slavery as an accurate reading of this story. So in her afterword to the story, she says this: "It amazes me that some people have seen Bloodchild as a story of slavery. It isn't. It's a love story between two very different beings." And then in another interview that I read, she elaborates on this. She says, "It is basically a love story, but so many critics have read this as a story about slavery, probably just because I'm black. The only places I am writing about slavery is where I actually say so." So she's very firm about this in her statements, but as we all know, the author doesn't necessarily get the last word, right? So with all due respect to Butler, I think, rather than closing the question altogether, it's probably more productive to ask, how is the human-Tlick relationship like and unlike slavery? And then this question divides into at least two linked paths of inquiry. First, how is the relationship like and unlike the enslavement of Black people in the Americas, which I think is what Butler means when she says this is not a story about slavery. And second, how is it like and unlike the abstract concept of slavery, meaning the systematic ownership and exploitation of one group of people by another group of people? So there's really a fascinating debate in the critical literature around this story between scholars who think it's irresponsible to contradict the author's reading and scholars who think it's irresponsible to abide by the author's reading. So there's a lot of back and forth about that. Many elements within the text support Butler's reading that this is a story about love, not slavery, especially the ending, Gan's final decision to affirm his love for Tiga Toy. But given the complexity of the story, I think it's more apt to say this is a story about both love and slavery and about the possibilities for love within systems of inequality and exploitation, which is something I'll be talking about more later. The second approach that I want to sketch briefly is the framework of gender and reproduction. So the story takes questions of bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom, questions that in our own world we most often, though not always, consider in relation to female bodies. And it transposes them into a very different world where all human bodies are vulnerable to these same questions. So the Tlick can implant fertilized eggs into any warm-blooded body, regardless of its sexual organs. But it turns out they tend to use male human hosts for their eggs, the reason being that human women should be left free to bear human children and keep their community alive. Furthermore, the extreme sexual dimorphism of the Tlick species results in a completely female-dominated culture. The males mature and die at a much faster rate than the females, so their only life function is reproduction. So Butler's created a world where the dominant sex-gender system on Earth has been reversed, and she's invented both biological and cultural reasons, justifications for doing so. The human male body is constructed as penetrable in two specific ways that are both conventionally associated with femininity. The first one is the penetration of Gan by Tiga Toy as she implants her fertilized egg and thus impregnates him. And two, and more graphically, the penetration of Bram, who is literally ripped open to deliver the young he bears in a kind of extreme and brutal cesarean section. So this is the passage of where Bram is cut open. And she opened him. His body convulsed with the first cut. He almost tore himself away from me. The sound he made, I had never heard such sounds come from anything human. Tiga Toy seemed to pay no attention as she lengthened and deepened the cut, now and then pausing to lick away blood. I felt as though I were helping her torture him, helping her consume him. I knew I would vomit soon, didn't know why I hadn't already. I couldn't possibly last until she was finished. And this is Gan's perspective. So this passage, I think, shows really clearly how you could read this story as a dramatization of the horrors of pregnancy, the way the body is rendered abject in the act of giving birth. And following that, you might question to what extent the visceral horror of this scene depends on the abject body being male, whereas dominant gender ideologies of our own culture locate the abjection of pregnancy as an expected and sometimes even necessary part of being female. So I don't have time to develop this line of questioning today, but I wanted to gesture at least towards both a queer reading of this story that explores Gan's relationship with Tiga Toy as gender fluid and non-normative, and a transgender reading of this story that identifies male pregnancy not as an absurd biological anomaly, but as a unique capacity or even a privilege of transmasculinity. So Gan is not transgender, but his situation, and the situation of the human males on this planet, demonstrates a really interesting disarticulation of pregnancy and femininity. So, with all that in mind, slavery, love, gender, reproduction, and queerness, and I'm trying to hold it all together because this story is so intersectional. I want to focus through the lens of species and read Bloodchild as a story of interspecies encounter. The Tlick planet, like Earth, is a place where species difference has an important function. The Earth that we live on is home to many, many species, about 8.7 billion species according to the latest estimate. But when it comes to the cultural importance of species difference, particularly when we're talking about modern industrialized West, the cultural importance of species difference tends to fixate on a single dividing line, which would be humans versus everything else. There's a lot of critical background to this that's really important for my work that I'm going to skip over today in favor of focusing on the story. But to put it in really broad and simple terms, the dominant tradition of the modern Western capitalist world asserts, first of all, that this is a line, this line between humans and animals exists in a straightforward way, and asserts, second, that this line between humans and animals also constitutes a line between persons and non-persons. Humans are persons who matter, animals are just beings that largely don't matter for their own sake, and often are treated as objects, tools, or things. So that's our planet, but the Tlick-Terran planet is in a somewhat different situation. It's a society where more than one species is understood to count as a person. The Tlick and the humans coexist because they've agreed to count each other as people, albeit two very different kinds of people in a largely unequal system. But on the other hand, this is not a multi-species utopia. These two kinds of people, the Tlick and the humans, are ontologically defined in opposition to all the other species on the planet, who are lumped together in the story as animals, and they're used for food and livestock, fur, etc. So, I want to map how species functions both biologically and discursively on the planet of Bloodchild. There are some obvious differences, but also some crucial similarities with the role of species on our own planet. First, we have the situation where the dominant species on this planet is not humankind. The humans have a clearly subordinate role. They didn't come to conquer, they came as refugees, and they would not have survived on this foreign planet without the help of their hosts. Which, by the way, makes Bloodchild, I think, a really interesting intervention into kind of imperialist tradition in science fiction that you often see. So usually in science fiction, when you have a human-alien encounter, it's a war, right, or a battle, or a conquest of some kind. But on this planet, it's about working it out together, right, and creating a livable society together. On this planet, it's not humans, but giant intelligent insects who are in charge. For the human characters, as well as the human reader, this is a strange situation. So generally speaking, right, if we tend to rank humans as higher than all other kinds of animals, we tend to rank pretty much any kind of animal higher than insects. Insects are pests, they carry diseases, they're not intelligent. That's kind of the general discourse of that, right? In certain cases, we might grant them ecological or cultural importance, but broadly speaking, human discourse figures insects as fundamentally killable. For most of us, insects are definitely not people. So Butler's afterword to this story, in fact, tells us that she wrote this story to deal with her fear of a particular insect, the parasitic botfly, which lays eggs on human skin so that its larvae can burrow underneath and feed on the host's body. So this is a quote. Here's some pictures of the botfly and this larva. This is from her afterword. She says, "I found the idea of a maggot living and growing under my skin, eating my flesh as it grew, to be so intolerable, so terrifying, that I didn't know how I could stand it if it happened to me. When I have to deal with something that disturbs me as much as the botfly did, I write about it. I sort out my problems by writing about them. Writing Bloodchild didn't make me like botflies, but for a while, it made them seem more interesting than horrifying." So we learn from this passage that the Tlick, right, some of the main characters of the story, are written specifically as her sort of intellectual working out of the botfly. So they're kind of like giant cousins of the flesh-eating botfly. And we see that the parasitism of the botfly gets worked into the reproductive processes that Gan is dealing with. At the same time, they're definitely people. And it's worth noting, this is a science fiction story, so they all speak the same language. They can talk to each other. They kind of think in the same ways. She gestures towards, I guess, like an affective difference. Like the Slick don't have the human demonstration of emotion that the Gan is expecting. But for the most part, they are on the same terms in terms of intelligence and emotional communication. So, they're definitely people requiring both human characters and human readers to revise their culturally defined expectations of what constitutes a person. So, This is Gan looking at Tigatoy. Tigatoy whipped her 3 meters of body off her couch, towards the door, and out at full speed. She had bones, ribs, a long spine, a skull, 4 sets of limb bones per segment. But when she moved that way, twisting, hurling herself into controlled falls, landing, running, she seemed not only boneless, but aquatic, something swimming through the air as though it were water. I loved watching her move. And that makes me think of, when you see like a centipede or a millipede and the way it moves, like, it's a very like animal, I don't know, it's a very like unfamiliar form of movement compared to the way like mammals move or that we move. And I like this passage because it shows how Gan is born on this planet. He's born out of the system of Earth norms when it comes to animals. So he sees this insectoid body and this like weird movement as something beautiful. So by making the Tlick so radically animal in terms of their embodiment, Butler is taking critical advantage of the SF trope of alien encounter. For an encounter with otherworldly beings requires a people to figure out how exactly they want to define personhood. And in this story, both the humans and the Tlick have to do that, right? Because the humans are actually the aliens in this story. They're the ones arriving from outer space. The alien presents a shock to any existing biological and cultural system of sorting person from non-person life. If an alien is both animal-like and person-like, there are at least 2 possible consequences. The first is that the category of personhood might be slightly enlarged, right? You can redraw the boundaries to accommodate one new form of life. But then on the other hand, the second, more radical possibility is that the very stability of the category of personhood might be unsettled. For if these new animal-like creatures count as people, then how many other creatures, worldly and otherworldly, might also count as people? So what we see in Bloodchild is that the Tlick and the Terrans each have a strong stake in treating each other as persons. At the same time, this mutual recognition is hampered on both sides by xenophobic and speciesist residues. For the humans, this residue manifests as a lingering disregard for animals that reaches back towards the anthropocentrism of their home planet. The 2 examples here. My mother made a wordless sound of annoyance. I should have stepped on you when you were small enough, she muttered. It was an old joke between them. So Gan's mother, Lean, makes a joke with her longtime friend, right, about the human propensity to step on insects. So how killable an insect is like a way that she jokingly chides her friend for doing something she doesn't like. I should have killed you when you were tiny. And the second, this is Tigatoy talking. We, the Tlick, saw them, the humans, as people and gave them a preserve when they still tried to kill us as worms. So we see that when the first humans arrived, they had the mindset of insects being killable, right? Worms were something they wanted to kill. On the other hand, in a parallel kind of formation, the Tlick also have a speciesist residue that manifests in their historical and continued desire to exploit the humans as breeding bodies. So this is Gan's point of view relating some history. He says, back when the Tlick saw us as not much more than convenient, big, warm-blooded animals, they would pen several of us together, male and female, and feed us only eggs. That way they could be sure of getting another generation of us, no matter how we tried to hold out. We were lucky that didn't go on long. A few generations of it, and we would have been little more than convenient, big animals. So the early humans, when they arrive, are recognized by the Tlick only as functional bodies, not as people. All their agency is removed, they're imprisoned, drugged, forced to carry Tlick eggs, and also coerced into reproducing with each other. This is a passage that evokes both the historical enslavement of humans and the human domestication of animals. And what's especially interesting here is that Gan tacitly asserts a continuity between human and animal life. He's recognizing the human-animal divide as something contingent, not absolute. That is, if a group of beings are stripped of agency and treated like non-persons, they become non-persons. He says, we would have become nothing more than convenient big animals. And this has 2 implications. First, it says that there's nothing inherently special about humankind. The human dominance, according to Gann's passage here, is the result of privilege and power rather than an intrinsic superiority to other beings. And second implication, it suggests that maybe other creatures that are classified as animals could also emerge as persons if they weren't kept in captivity and stripped of all agency. So instead of a clean person, non-person divide here, Gann suggests that the real division is between beings who are allowed by those empowered to exercise their personhood and beings who are not. So from these early days, the relationship between the Tlick and the Terrans has evolved from clear exploitation to a kind of troubled interspecies symbiosis. They're interdependent in a way that is mutually beneficial, but also clearly unequal. The story focuses on one such symbiotic pairing between Gann and Tigatoy. It shows us their extreme bodily and cultural differences. It reminds us of the history of violence between their kinds. It highlights the significant power disparity between them, and that manifests in a number of ways. It's not just the species hierarchy, but it's also Tigatoy's large size. She's way bigger than Gann. She can push him around if he disobeys, and she does. Her status as a government official, so she's in charge of this preserve. Her job as the dealer of humans to Tlick, and her mature age, all these things establish her control over the relationship. And Gann is really just a boy with very few resources of his own. His age isn't given, but it seems like he's probably a teenager. Given all of these over-determining factors, Bloodchild asks, is it possible that what exists between Gann and Tigatoy can be authentic love? That is, can you love someone who has domesticated you? Can you love someone whom you have domesticated? Or on the other hand, is Gann the victim of some kind of Stockholm Syndrome type delusion when he chooses to affirm his love for Tigatoy and step into his role as reproductive partners? And people do read this story in both of those directions. So by posing these questions and leaving them open, Bloodchild offers itself as a speculative framework for reconceiving human-animal relationships on Earth. It addresses itself specifically to relationships of domestication, in which humans manage animal populations in order to use them for some purpose, for food, labor, resources, companionship, or some combination of those. In Bloodchild, humans occupy a role analogous to those of domesticated animals on Earth. Their continued survival is predicated on their service to the Tlick hosts. Yet, Gann insists that he can accept these terms and still be Tigatoy's partner, her fellow person, not her thing. In the climax of the story, Gann offers his body for implantation of Tigatoy's egg, but refuses to surrender his illegal guns. You recall that humans aren't allowed to own guns after the rebellions of the previous generations, but their family has some guns hidden in their house. I lowered the gun from my throat, and she leaned forward to take it. No, I told her. It's the law, she said. Leave it for the family. One of them might use it to save my life someday. She grasped the rifle barrel, but I wouldn't let go. I was pulled into a standing position over her. Leave it here, I repeated. If we're not your animals, if these are adult things, accept the risk. There is risk, Atoy, in dealing with a partner. So here, Gann's gun figures a kind of unexpected and illicit agency. It represents the human family's capacity to exceed the restrictive programs that have been constructed for them by the Tlick. It is thus dangerous not only in the harm it can inflict as an actual weapon, but in the shift in power it enables. Tigatoy's reluctant decision to let Gann keep the gun is one step toward making him her partner rather than her thing. Gann voices here what I see as the kind of moral of this story. There is risk in dealing with a partner. Dealing with an object is easy. You can do to it whatever you want and take from it whatever you need. You have no obligation to let it flourish. You are justified in shaping and reducing it to match your own needs. Dealing with a partner, on the other hand, is difficult. Partners, even though they may not be equal, must have a shared stake in each other's well-being. They must recognize each other as agents and as persons in all their difference. There's risk in dealing with a partner, and yet, Bloodchild argues, partnership is a better kind of relationship than exploitation. Not only is it better ethically, but it makes, this story argues, it makes for a richer and livelier world where diverse kinds of beings can be bound in these intimate and mutually fulfilling affective networks. So I'm ending, rather than concluding, this talk with some big questions that arise from my reading of this text. First, what would it take to make humans and animals equal in our world? Well, I think this is more or less an impossible question to entertain. It's not only that discourses of anthropocentrism are so deeply and extensively embedded in our lives that it would be hard to imagine the world any other way. It's also, there's so much diversity to non-human life, so many different kinds of bodies, minds, and relationships and interests. How could equality, which depends on a certain kind of sameness, ever exist across that spectrum of difference? But Bloodchild offers an alternative question, which is, what would it take to make humans and animals partners in our world? How might humans adjust their relationships of use with non-human animals toward collaboration and away from indifferent exploitation, as the Tlick do slowly and begrudgingly in their relationships with humans? And finally, could the story of humans and animals in the modern world be revised into, as Butler calls this story, a love story? And a love story that is as complex, ambivalent, and compelling as the love story of Bloodchild. So that's where I'm ending, and I would love to hear any thoughts that you have on any of this. Thanks.